if the next panel could come forward and assemble, and we'll get started in our seamless way.
Was willing. He is a tremendous retirement guru in my perspective. He's created the state and local pension exchange, which was the predecessor to the public fund survey, and he has practical experience, having worked in a state system prior to his research director role at NASRA. Elizabeth Keller heads the Center for State and Local Government Excellence, and she has done a remarkable job in coordinating some of the research that is moving through the field in tandem with Boston College and other organizations, specifically putting hard numbers on the changing realities of pension solvency. And Greg Long, for those of you who don't know him, who are not either federal employees or who are not DC-based people, is the executive director of the Federal, let me get this right, I always give it wrong, Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. And I must tell you how much I admire the work that Greg has done in creating a menu of reform policies at his organization. It's really an opportunity. If you look at the TSP program, it's a leader in some of the strategic planning and redesign of retirement programs that I think are bellwethers of what we may need to do at the state and local levels as well. So I'm delighted we have his practical experience here today. I think we will begin, Keith, if we may, with you. And I'm glad to see, Keith, you're wearing the blue and gold colors of the UC system. I don't know if that was intentional, but we certainly appreciate our speakers being so sympathetic.
With all respect to University of California, that's strictly by accident. I was asked to prepare some remarks regarding what states are considering doing and what they have done recently in the order of sustainability of these public pension plans. And before I get into some of the details of what has been done and is being seriously considered around the country, I wanted to talk just briefly about the context that these states are operating in. As you probably know, if you understand the federal system, every state is unique. Indeed, every public pension plan is unique, and so the conditions and the environment that each pension plan is facing is different. And then, of course, there are varying political issues to consider as well. And as a result, the degree and the extent and the type of changes is going to range from very little to substantial and fundamental. Three basic levers, just to help compartmentalize your thinking, three basic levers that pension plans and their plan sponsors have to consider include the benefit structures, of course, financing arrangements, who pays and how much they pay, and then the actuarial methods and processes. And I think it's useful to keep in mind that it is often the case, considering the very long-term nature that these pension plans operate, and some of the earlier speakers have alluded to this, when you think about the relationship that many plan participants have with their retirement system, often it will exist for, that can be a 50 to 80 year relationship. And as a result of that, it is often the case that a relatively small change in either a plan design, a benefit structure, or financing arrangement can have a significant impact over the long term on the viability and sustainability of the pension plan. There are a number of variables to consider in the legal realm, and I'm not an attorney. There are a number of considerations, though, that affect whether and how you can affect these retirement plans. My understanding is there are 9 state constitutions that specify public pension benefits, and whether or not, in fact, specifically, the fact that the state cannot, in those nine cases, diminish or reduce pension benefit levels. More common are statutory protections, also case law, and frankly, this is an area of law that has yet to be fully tested, and I think that we're going to see a number of of challenges to case law and statutes, perhaps even constitutions around the country. In fact, we already are beginning to see some of those challenges, and I'll talk in detail about what challenges are underway right now. Of course, the groups that are directly affected when plan sponsors begin to consider making changes to these pension plans include new hires, existing active retirees, existing actives and existing retirees. And you might view this as a spectrum. It's very easy politically to make plan design changes for new hires because they really don't have a political constituency. A little more difficult to make changes to existing plan participants. And then, of course, when you begin to make changes to people who are already receiving a benefit, that is a little bit more controversial. In some cases, it's specifically forbidden by constitution or case law or statute, and when it's simply often the case that you're disrupting people's lives and taking away their benefits. Also, in terms of compartmentalization, it might be useful to think of the two types of reform that are being considered, falling into the categories of either incremental and fundamental. And in some cases, to the extent that changes need to be made, they might be just relatively minor incremental changes. In other cases, some people believe that more fundamental changes are in order. And I'm going to talk about a few of the changes that have been made in the last couple of years, but I think it's useful also to keep in mind that changes to public pension plans have been occurring for years, as long as these public pension plans have been around. Sometimes I will speak with people who seem to be truly surprised that these plan designs can change at all, but that happens on a regular basis. At any given point, legislatures and city councils and so on are making changes to these public pension plans. However, certainly in the post-2008 environment, the magnitude and the extent of changes has changed significantly. There are certainly a lot more states. In fact, just about every plan sponsor in the last couple of years, to some degree, have been reviewing the sustainability of their pension plans, the plan design, and so on. And the changes that I'm going to talk about here, I've categorized in terms of the type of change rather than going on a state-by-state basis. And I cannot assure you this is an exhaustive list, but I'm trying to provide a sort of a representative sample of the changes that are being made. But I'm starting generally with the changes that tend to have the biggest cost or actuarial impact. And as I go through it, it'll tend toward smaller or lower actuarial impacts. And as you might expect, increasing the retirement age at which someone begins to qualify for a normal retirement benefit tends to get your biggest bang for the buck, the most immediate cost effect and the largest cost effect. Also, the number of years required to work in order to receive a normal retirement benefit. And you can see just in the last couple of years, a lot of states have done that, and other states continue to consider changes like this. In most cases, not all, but in most cases, when a state increases the age or the years of service or both in order to qualify for a normal retirement benefit, they also will change the early retirement benefit. Standard model in the public sector is that if you choose to retire early, there's a penalty applied, a reduction to the so-called normal retirement benefit. And typically, if a state changes its normal retirement age from, say, age 60 to 62, typically they'll move up the minimum age of early retirement from, say, 55 to 57, or what they'll do is increase the penalty if they keep it at age 55, for example. Cost of living adjustments are common in the public sector. About 2/3 to 3/4 of these public pension plans offer some form of an automatic cost of living adjustment. A cost of living adjustment also often is a surprisingly expensive plan provision, and plan sponsors find that they can achieve significant cost savings sometimes by adjusting downward the cost of living adjustments, and you can see a number of states have done this in the last year. I want to point out that Colorado adjusted their automatic cost of living adjustment for existing retirees in February of this year. And I believe it was literally the next day a lawsuit was filed on behalf of a group of retirees. And Colorado does not have a constitutional protection. They have statutory protections. The protection is not perfectly clear, and I think it'll be a very interesting test case to find out how much viability that challenge to the state's ability to make modifications to the existing retirees' benefits will have. Another change that some states have made in the last couple of years are a reduction to the retirement multiplier. This is the 2% or 2.5%, 1.5% that helps determine the amount of the retirement benefit. Nevada did this last year, and they applied it to all new hires only as of, I think, next year. Everybody in the state who's public employees hired in the state as of next year will have a lower retirement multiplier. Rhode Island has applied this. They've done this a couple of times in the last few years, and they've applied it to all non-vested existing participants. And just this week I saw that a group of public employee unions has filed suit in the state of Rhode Island. It'll be another interesting test case to find out how much viability that change has. Typically, these plan provisions are plan benefits are based on the final few years of service. 3 or 5 is common, but many of the states that have a final average salary period of 3 years have begun to move theirs up to 4 or 5. You don't get a lot of bang for the buck out of that, but it does help reduce the issue of spiking, and it also generally will reduce the overall benefit. A number of states have moved toward asking employees to increase their contributions, and all of the states that are listed here in the form of higher employee contributions are applying these higher contributions to existing plan participants. I don't know of any. The only state that I know of in which there was a lawsuit filed was New Mexico. And what the state did in New Mexico last year applied to all public employees in the state, and basically the legislature said we're going to reduce employer contributions by 1.5%, and we're going to increase employee contributions by 1.5%. So they just replaced 1.5% of the contribution. Didn't generate any more income. They just changed who was paying how much into the system. And a group of public employee unions filed suit, but that suit so far, that was about a year ago, and that suit has not gone anywhere in New Mexico. Back in the early 1980s, Virginia began to relieve their state employees of contributions to the retirement system. They did this in lieu of a salary adjustment. And basically the state said, instead of giving you a salary increase, we're going to begin to pick up your employee contribution. And so for the last 25, 28 years, the plan participants in the Virginia retirement system have not been making contributions. Well, one of the political issues associated with that is that over time people forget that the contributions began to be picked up in lieu of a salary increase, and people only recognize or believe that the employees are not making a contribution. And so it's a little bit of a political challenge for the public employees, because there's this perception out there that they're not making a contribution, and indeed they're not, but the reasons for them not making a contribution has become long forgotten. There was a lot of anticipation leading up to the legislative session in Virginia this year that the legislature would begin to apply employee contributions to the existing plan participants. In fact, they did not do that. Only new hires in the state of Virginia as of next year will begin to make contributions to the Virginia retirement system. Longer vesting periods. This is a change that I hate to see. I think that it's one of the attributes of defined benefit plans to have shorter vesting periods. It keeps them away from the stereotype of defined benefit plans being dinosaurs or old-fashioned type of retirement plans. And when you're requiring a 10-year vesting period, it can serve as a discouraging factor in terms of folks who want to come to work for the public sector for only a certain period of time. But so I hate to see a number of states have begun to apply longer vesting periods. In each of these cases, though, they apply only to new hires. These anti-spiking provisions generally take the form of a limitation on the percentage of salary increase that the retirement plan will recognize in terms of when it calculates the retirement benefit. For those of you who might not know, what spiking is an effort to significantly increase one's retirement benefit by increasing their level of compensation, their salary, in the last few years that they worked, typically the period over which the retirement benefit is calculated. It is an actuarial issue, but frankly, with regard to the public pension community, more than an actuarial issue, it's a political issue. It creates public perception problems that these public employees are gaming the system. And so anti-spiking provisions, of course, have a cost associated with them, but they also can help save some of the political issues. Return to work also has another name like anti-spiking, and that is so-called double dipping. And sometimes that also has political problems. And I won't go into double dipping except to say that sometimes it is the case that the best, most available and best qualified person to do a job in the public sector happens to be someone who is retired from the public sector. And so sometimes, often the media will talk about return to work provisions or double dipping as if by definition they are problematic and they are abusive, but they are not always abusive. Often there are very valid reasons for asking public employees to come back to work, but particularly in response to concerns about these return to work provisions encouraging people to retire sooner than they otherwise would, knowing that they're going to come back to work. A number of states have begun to implement these return to work changes. And then Illinois implemented a change that's actually fairly unusual in the public sector, and that's just a flat dollar or percentage limitation on the retirement benefit. A couple of others I want to talk about real fast. Utah retirement system has been non-contributory for many years. The employer has made all of the contributions. The system actually is in reasonably good actuarial condition, but there were forces in the legislature that wanted to change the plan design, and so what they did this year was, for all new hires as of July next year, will have their choice between a defined contribution plan and a hybrid. And the hybrid is a traditional defined benefit plan combined with mandatory participation in the defined contribution plan. The DB component is a relatively modest benefit. But what was interesting about this Utah model is that it's still non-contributory. Both the defined contribution and the defined benefit components will have their contributions made entirely by the public employers, not by the employees. And then in the last couple of years, Kentucky and Georgia have established these similar hybrid models that feature a traditional defined benefit plan, but with a much more modest multiplier. I think 1% in Kentucky and 1.25% in Georgia, combined with participation in a defined contribution plan. What's troubling to me about the Georgia model is that participation in the defined contribution component is optional. And we know that a lot of those employees are going to opt out of the defined contribution plan. You know, state employees are not exactly highly paid, and they don't have a lot of discretionary income. And when you give them the choice to have 4 or 5% in their pocket or in their retirement plan, they're going to take the money in their pocket each time. And my final slide here overlaps something that Professor Ghilarducci touched on, and that is a listing of the distinguishing features of public pension plan designs. And I don't want to get away without listing these. I consider these to be essential elements of a good retirement plan, and this bears a lot of relationship to the elements that that Professor Ghilarducci touched on. Mandatory participation, all of these, if those of you who are involved in the public sector tend to take these things for granted. Outside the public sector, not so much. In fact, by and large, you cannot take these for granted at all in the outside the public sector. I think someone alluded earlier to the fact that only just over 1/2 of the nation's private sector workforce is participating at all in a retirement benefit that's sponsored by their employer. And in the public sector, by and large, when you come to work for a public sector employer, you automatically are enrolled in the retirement plan, and you do not have a choice. By and large, public employees are required to make contributions to their retirement plan. This has a couple of benefits. One is that it gets their own skin in the game, increases their awareness and sensitivity to retirement issues, and of course it has a positive cost impact. The benefits of pooling assets, required annuitization, you can read those for yourself, and in the interest of time I'll move on to the next speaker. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
I can't see this at all. I can't see it at all on here.
Allison, can you help her with the slides? Thank you. Or Danny?
I can't see the screen.
You need some of our vitamins. I can see that there's an opportunity here. The question is whether these presentations will be available online. And let me just react while Elizabeth is finding her folder. We've been fortunate to receive the PowerPoint presentations from our speakers. They will be online. It will take us a while to get them all loaded, but we hope to have them online and available to all of you.
Researchers, sometimes we do our own research, but usually we partner with universities that have strong capabilities to really probe questions that we think policymakers are interested in. So we're in this environment where we've not only got the fiscal challenges that others have talked about, but I haven't heard very many people talk about our workforce challenges. So I am going to talk a little bit about that. I call this a little bit of the perfect storm. So just at a time when all of our revenue sources are down, we also have an older population of workers, talented people, who we're going to have a tough time replacing. And I think that just as we start recovering from our revenue shortfalls in state and local government, we're going to be looking around and trying to figure out who we have to carry out some of the difficult work that we have to do that requires a lot of advanced education and training to do. And then you heard Ray Shapak this morning talk about the turmoil that we're facing on the elected official side with for sure 24 governors changing this year because they're open seats, and probably as many as 30 states seeing perhaps a change in political direction. So I won't go over this one. This is kind of more of that doom and gloom that I think Ray Shapak covered very well this morning, but just as a reminder that we're probably heading into the toughest couple of years for state and local governments in front of us. On the human resource side, one of the things that we've done are some online surveys with human resource managers who work in state and local governments, IPMA HR, and the National Association of State Personnel Executives. And it just gives us context for what is going on right now and what they're seeing on the horizon. At the top of the list, about 70% are implementing hiring freezes, another 65% pay freezes. We've got 50%, 40 to 50% doing layoffs, another 30% doing furloughs, and you see next on the list at just under 20%, early retirement incentives. And I'm one of those people who questions how wise early retirement incentives are, especially knowing we have this talent crisis just around the corner. So what's happening? Now that we had the economic downturn in 2008, what are people in state and local government doing? Are they staying on the job longer? Are they retiring earlier? And in our survey, we found out that 46% say their employees are delaying retirements. And 11% say employees are accelerating their retirements that in an effort to try to avoid changes that they think will be detrimental. I believe a lot of these are in California. We saw that state have a huge jump in retirements because there's so much turmoil in that state. So when we're competing for talent, one of the things that we struggle with in government is that we know traditionally our good benefits have been a big part of what distinguishes us from the private sector. In the 1980s, when we had the last serious recession, one of the problems we had when we had the hiring freezes and layoffs and the rest of the belt tightening that you have to do in government to balance your budget, they looked around when we started to recover to see who was in the pipeline to take the jobs, and they looked and they found they hadn't hired those entry-level jobs, middle management was thin. And so we did a compensation study recently, and we also saw that we had to have a big jump in our salaries, our hiring salaries in the late 80s. So it's just going to hit us a lot harder this time because I think the recession's been deeper, and then we have this talent challenge along with it. We also know that we have no choice right now but to look at our benefits. And so where we're looking very intensively in state and local government is on the health care side. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board has required that we take a hard look at our unfunded liabilities for retiree health care. And I think we already know we have dramatic reductions in retiree health care offerings because that's generally not protected by state law or state constitution. And again, it's not that anybody wants to cut, but they must. And so this is an area that's getting hit very hard. Other places that are more able to do so are establishing trust funds and doing other things to fund their retiree health. And those are the success stories out there that we'd like to see more of in the future. We've heard others talk about what's going on in terms of pension plans and contributions. So I think one of the things we're seeing in the general public reaction is there's a lot of anger out there that we in the public sector have a pension more frequently than those in the private sector do. And so this just really points out the difference in the private sector, and some only 40% in the private sector have some sort of a pension compared to 71, 72% in government. So we talked already a little bit about these retirement delays, and I'm going to move into the study that's in your packet that looks at the funding status of state and local plans based on the most current data available. This was work that was done by researchers at Boston College, a team led by Alicia Munell. They studied 126 state and local plans. They're all listed in the back of the document for those of you who want to dive into it and see exactly which plans are in the study. And they also did projections for 2010 through 2013, and I think it gives you an interesting and somewhat disturbing picture of the challenges ahead. So key findings are that, of course, we know that our pensions were over 80% funded in 2008 in general. There were always the places like Illinois and New Jersey that were not at that level. But in 2009, only 36% of plans in this study were funded at that level. And the concern is that most plans will not return to 80% funding levels by 2013 unless contribution levels increase, or as Kathleen told us earlier today, we get this big boom in the stock market, and that really takes care of all of our worries. I also think it's important to remind ourselves that we're not that different in the public sector compared to the private sector. Again, this was a comparison done by our research team at Boston College, looking at how well funded we were in the public sector compared to the private sector. In this case, it just goes through 2006. But the same thing happened after the downturn in the market. We lost as much money as the private sector did because we're similarly invested in equity. So we share the joys and the pain of being pension plans that do invest in equities. This is a chart that gives you a sense of how bad the funding levels are today. And this is pretty sobering to me. What we're looking at here, you've kind of got pillars on each end. These are the real problem plans that we're talking about, where they're not funded. We have just get the number right here. These are the ones that are really struggling. And in general, if you take this group here, the 47% and the 11%, you've got 58% of plans that have funding below the acceptable 80% level in 2009. And of course, over on this end, just to remind us, we do have 10% of plans that are operating at that 100% level or higher. The aggregate funding level for all plans was 78%, not where we'd like it to be. One of the things that the research team did was to take a look at what happens with 3 different scenarios if you're looking at what the equity performance is going to be. This chart shows the ups and downs of the stock market in recent years, and it lays out with these 3 scenarios at the end a most likely stock market performance based on the Wilshire 500 index, and then an optimistic performance and a pessimistic performance, which basically means we would stay flat and not see any growth from today forward. What this does is lets us know, based on these economic assumptions, that we'll see the most pessimistic projection would be rising unemployment and profits growing at 3% annually, with the stock market at roughly 12,000. The most likely projection assumes economic expansion that reduces unemployment slightly, with profits growing 7% annually, and the Wilshire 5,000 reaching 15,000 by 2013. And then this also assumes a significant decline in unemployment the most optimistic scenario would assume a significant decline in unemployment, allowing profits and stock prices to grow nearly 11% annually. So we'd see a Wilshire 5,000 at 18,000 by 2013. But none of those look good, do they? Because if you'll notice, even with the optimistic scenario, we're still under 80% funding. And a lot of this has to do with the smoothing that is catching us up with the problems of the stock market losses that we've had in 2008. So that the most likely scenario means that our assets and pension plans will be about 77% of promised benefits. And then by 2013, that would drop to 72%. The pessimistic ratio would be 66% in 2013. The optimistic would be 76%. So as I say to anyone in the room who's an optimist, even those of us who are optimistic aren't really going to be very happy with the challenges that we have ahead. Keith has talked about what plan sponsors are doing, and I think gave a very comprehensive view of that. Where do we go from here? What are people talking about in state and local government sector? Well, I think the public debate is really about what rewards are appropriate for a career of public service, and then once we figure that out, how do we make sure that we price them and fund them appropriately? You've seen a lot of discussion about how many years you should have to vest in a plan. How are new hires treated? What should the normal retirement age be? One thing that I didn't originally have in my presentation, but we did a study that we released in January on pension obligation bonds. And given that we were talking about using debt as a way to finance pensions, I have to weigh in with a skeptic view of this, because at least our study found that the places that are most likely to use pension obligation bonds are the ones who should least do so, because they can't afford the risk that's involved. And it's really, to me, it's a little bit like gambling. If you're gambling that much with your pension monies, it, I think, just could exacerbate your problems. If you're already in trouble, at least the data show that you're likely to be in more trouble. You're the ones that go after these pension obligation bonds. The other debate that is interesting that I hadn't had in my talk originally was about this issue of return to work. And it kind of gets back to the talent challenge that we have. I really think that we ought to be looking closely at our desire to have older workers contributing more to Social Security and contributing more in ways that they can to our organizations. When I was on the Montgomery County Ethics Commission, we would periodically have people come in for waivers to be able to come back to work. And they had very sophisticated backgrounds in traffic engineering or other areas of expertise that were badly needed. I would just think as employers we should be getting ahead of the curve and trying to find ways to be smart about this so we can bring people back to work and perhaps in a way that benefits our organizations financially, as well as allows some mentoring of those workers that I'm afraid are going to be kind of green coming into the organization. So we have some political challenges ahead. Generational equity, I think, is going to be a very big concern. The whole issue of transparency. If you're in the management side of government, having to manage a workforce with multiple tiers is no picnic, and so that's going to be a tough situation. I think hybrid plans seem to be a growing trend. Getting that right, doing it smart, is going to be another challenge that we have to think about. The competition that properly funding our retirement promises has with all the other drivers for really important service needs and other obligations is going to be challenging. And at the end of the day, who is going to pay? I think a lot of people in the state and local government world are really wary of seeing the federal government have a significant role, because our experience with the federal government coming in to help us has not worked out too well in a number of ways. So we are skeptics on that perspective. I noticed there was, I think it was Kathleen who talked about this a little bit, but a few things to think about when we look at our retirement plans. We really are doing a lot of things right in the public sector, because in general, we expect people to contribute if you're an employee, and our assets are managed professionally. And I also liked the suggestion Kathleen made, and perhaps others, about our plans, to the extent they're able to, being a place for private employees to be able to buy into, is something that makes a lot of sense to me. Just a little final note, all of our publications are available free on our website, including the one I mentioned on the pension obligation bond, so urge you to take advantage of them.
Thank you very much.
When Kathleen invited me to come speak, she asked if I had any slides, and I don't. And
That is a relief at this point, I'm sure.
My name is Greg Long. I help run the Thrift Savings Plan, and I'm the executive director of the Federal Retirement Thrift Investment Board. I'm going to tell you a story today, hopefully not too lengthy, but a story about how the federal government dealt with very similar challenges to what the states are dealing with now. When Kathleen asked me about the slides, I said to myself, we've got an important story here. And so I'm offering you, Kathleen, if you find out that this is worthy of an academic paper, I'm not going to write it, but I got a feeling there are people in the room who might want to. The federal government created the Thrift Savings Plan. So first let me tell you a little bit about the TSP. The TSP is the largest 401k in the world. It is your mailman and your senator are both in it, and everybody in between. 4.3 million participants, encompassing a total of $250+ billion. So it's a honker of a plan. And we have participants right now in every single time zone, on every single ocean, below every ocean, and in space. So yeah, we've got a lot of people. The plan is thought of, and this is flattering to me, as a model in some respects. There's a few things that we do. We keep it simple. We have 5 basic options. We don't want people to get confused. We keep it simple from a operational perspective, which means when we get payroll, we get it the same from everybody. When somebody processes a loan, we don't allow great deals of variation and customization, because customization and paper are expensive. And from an investment perspective, in addition to keeping a small menu, institutional low-cost funds. I think we've heard that message several times from several people today. Costs matter, and they matter a lot. And so we take a great deal of pride in keeping our expense ratio very low. It's currently at 3 basis points, which is 0.03%, which means pretty much next to nothing. Now, there are some reasons for that, and there's some, economies of scale drive a lot of it. Now, the part of this story that I think is relevant to the audience is the crossroads that many state pension plans are currently at, because that crossroads was dealt with, or similar, by the federal government in 1983. And somebody earlier mentioned the Greenspan Commission. So in 1983, the federal government had a big Social Security problem. How were we going to be able to fund it? And we were actually at a month-to-month basis standpoint there, when we didn't know how we were going to fund Social Security payments. Now, anybody who was a federal employee was under the Civil Service Retirement System, which actually predated Social Security. We had multiple parties that got together, and there was a crisis. And unfortunately, that's when governments act sometimes, is when there's a crisis, when you've got a gun to your head. And they decided that what we would do is take federal employees who are under the old Civil Service Retirement System, not paying in to Social Security, and put them into Social Security. You now have 1 million more participants paying into Social Security that won't actually receive benefits for 10, 20, 30, or 40 years out. Problem solved, right? Well, that doesn't quite solve the problem. So we decided in theory that federal employees would now be paying into Social Security, but they needed to have a design that provided similar benefits to the old system. And that took 3 years of work. And it was, I, by the way, was in high school at the time this was done. So the collective wisdom which exists within my team and, quite frankly, in the room here was very helpful as I put this together. The Blue Ribbon Commission was chaired by Alan Greenspan, and there was a great deal of friction, certainly, in talking about moving from the CSRS to a new design. Federal employees at that time were saying, why should I have to give up my CSR defined benefit program that I love in order to save Social Security? Well, the reason is because Social Security was in trouble. There was a political imperative that had to be dealt with. The Congress was at a crossroads. And what they did that I think is remarkable over 3 years, and it's difficult to figure out how to do it today, but you got the collective bargaining groups, the administration and the White House, Capitol Hill, and multiple think tanks around this town, and worked out a solution. There was fighting, there was squabbling. It took 3 years to figure it out. There were certainly some people wanted to maintain a rich defined benefit plan. The Reagan administration at the time, who was certainly not very friendly to union organizations at that point, proposed a $5,000 super IRA, all defined contribution replacement. There were other people that wanted, in the industry, that wanted to come up with a 401k supermarket type approach. So multiple designs were kicked around. The GAO acted as the party that analyzed all this. The Congressional Budget Office hired the actuaries to figure out the replacement rate over time. And where this ended up, in 1986, after thorough ventilation of all the stakeholders, they faced a deadline. At that point, if we didn't come up with a solution, all federal employees would be under Social Security and the civil service retirement system at the same time. So, again, negotiating with a gun to your head. So if they didn't fix it, you'd have a 14% contributions from two places from the employee, total of 14% of pay, and you'd be receiving full CSRS benefits and full Social Security benefits, and a situation that simply could not occur. So we ended up with what is now called FERS, the Federal Employee Retirement System. It is a three-tiered system. If you are a federal employee today, you get a defined benefit plan. It's watered down, is the nice way to put it, from the CSRS plan. It pays approximately half of what the old defined benefit plan paid. You get Social Security, which people hired before 1983 did not get, and you get the option of a 401k, which is now known as the Thrift Savings Plan, TSP. That design, and it was tilted in such a way so that for low-paid people, and this is because of the Social Security tilt, low-paid people, in order to receive benefits equivalent to CSRS, didn't have to put any money in. There was a 1% automatic, but they didn't need to put money in to match the previous benefits. The vast majority of federal employees needed to contribute about 5% of pay, which is why the TSP is created today with a 5% matching scheme. 100% on the first 3%, 50 cents on the dollar for the next two. Only at the highest pay scales would you need to contribute at a greater level than 5% in order to match the CSRS benefits previously. So what we ended up with, and I know, quite frankly, not everybody agrees with this. There's still a whole bunch of federal employees out there that say the old system was better. But the structure, according to the actuaries, is that the design today provides pay benefits equivalent, in some cases, frankly, better, than the old system. And that message is what allowed the collective bargaining groups, Capitol Hill, the administration, and the White House to get together. And yes, there was a deadline. And that also allowed them to get together as well and create FERS, create the TSP. The arrangement kept the bargain, is what it boils down to. It kept the bargain that the first-year employees would receive benefits comparable to the CSRS defined benefit, just now from different sources. You still have a DB, you still have Social Security, and you now get the TSP. And what we do from our end is try to maintain a TSP that is constantly looking at expenses, keeping it simple, and looking at innovation. Some of the things we're looking at now are automatic enrollment, Roth, and some other features. But that's how the federal government dealt with the crossroads back in 1983. To the extent that it's instructive to the people in the room, I'm thrilled to talk about it.
Thank you. Can we give a round of applause? Do we have any questions from the audience? If so, please approach the microphone. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Alana Bovey. I'm with the National Institute on Retirement Security. I thought a key statistic from that BC study, Beth, that you mentioned, but that you didn't mention in your presentation, was that Alicia Bennell actually projected that if contributions increase by 2.2% of payroll, kind of across the gamut of state and local systems, that the entire unfunded liability could be paid off over 30 years. That's all the unfunded liabilities that are kind of continuing to accrue now. And I thought that number was really interesting for two reasons. First being that it seems very different than the numbers that Dr. Raw presented earlier, that maybe it's much less of a drastic problem. But also that 2.2 is very similar to Social Security's projections of what they're going to need to increase contributions by. Social Security has said that if they increase by 1% on each side, the employer and the employee, then they can, close that gap. And we can do the same thing in the public sector, 1% on each side. At the same time, Keith, you were talking about all these different changes that are being made in these systems in terms of benefit levels and so forth, not necessarily contribution levels. So I was wondering, this might be kind of a tough question to answer, but has anyone looked at kind of what the value of those changes in benefit levels and so forth would have in terms of additional contributions that are saved? In other words, states such as Colorado and Minnesota have kind of already, to a certain extent, fixed their problem. They've made a whole series of changes in order to close that gap. And I don't know. I guess it's kind of a tough question.
Why don't we stop at that point, because they may forget your first question. Thank you. But let's start with giving Elizabeth a chance to respond to the question that you asked about the data that she did not include. And, of course, she couldn't include everything in her brief presentation today. Do you want to comment on that, Elizabeth? And then we'll ask Keith to respond to your other question. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I think that the core point is really good that you're making, that it is the pensions generally, if you take a long view of them, and there's time to work through these issues, and I think that funding level is probably going to work for most plans. I think it's also true that there are some pension plans, and Illinois would be one, Connecticut would be another, where that is probably not going to solve the problem at that level. So I think it's kind of like yes and yes.
Keith.
I guess I would only say that the contribution gap, for lack of a better term, varies widely from one plan to another and one state to another, and in some cases relatively minor changes in plan design or contribution will solve the problem. In other cases, it's more of a structural issue where 4 or 5 or 6% or even more needs to be resolved.
Thank you.
Something real quick, which is just that under my projections, you would need to raise contributions. Total contributions across all states were about $100 billion. Last year, you'd have to raise them by at least 50%. So you have to get them up to 50 billion more. Total payroll was about $600 billion for these employees. I see an increase that is way bigger than 2%. If you just wanted to put it back over the next 10 years, that's what you would need to do, increase it. Contribute an additional $50 billion nationally, annually to these funds over the next 10 years. So
And I think some of it is the timeline that you're choosing, whether it's 10, 20, or 30 years. So
Okay.
that's the other.
I still can't see how you get 2%. But,
Yeah.
I think Keith may want to comment on this because my point's exactly on that. From a quick glance at the two studies, it appears that a major difference in where they're coming out is that Alicia is using existing GASB accounting standards where the discount rate is equivalent to the investment rate of return, whereas it looks like you're using more of a FASB private sector approach where the discount rate is different than the investment rate of return. I know GASB's been studying that issue. Keith, is there any update on where they are on that, and how much of a difference that alone? My memory is that difference alone would account for about a 30% difference in estimated liability, give or take, which would significantly affect the required contribution level.
GASB is expected to produce their so-called preliminary views document next month, and that's not a final document, as the name implies, but it's an indication of where they are headed. And it appears that their preliminary views document will, by and large, honor the existing standard in which plans are allowed to rely on their long-term expected rate of return, but not so much to the extent that the plan is underfunded. The plan, to the extent that the plan lacks the assets to meet its obligations, they may not assume the same 8% of return. They would have to use a lower, more closer to a risk-free type of return for assets they do not have. So sort of a blended rate, but closer to the existing arrangement.
I would just like to comment that everyone in this room needs to be alert to the GASB guidance comments that are going to be coming out in June. I think they're going to have profound impacts on a lot of the valuation issues we've talked about today in terms of retirement funds. And I would ask, and I see Dallas is shaking his head, I would ask that if you are committed to this issue, that you want to spend a lot of time looking at it and perhaps engage others in your circle to send informal comment letters to GASB, because I think that's going to help provide some recognition. I do think one thing we have to be aware of is that GASB is, in at least my opinion, going in the right direction about the transparency, though. That these cash flows, that the discount rates, the investment rates, the lump sum distribution calculations have got to be transparent, so that those who want to go out there and evaluate whether it's a solid presentation of the facts are able to do so. So that at least will be, I think, helpful. Sir, you've been waiting a long time.
Thank you. I'm Sandy Mckenzie from the Public Policy Institute of AARP, and I wanted first to say that I thought the presentations were great, really, really good. My question is for Keith, and I wanted to ask him if he could say a little bit more about the extent to which the various measures that he enumerated, which was very helpful, didn't simply affect new hires, but old hires, existing members of the plan, and even retirees.
Most of the examples that were cited in my studies apply, in my slides, apply to new hires, although the higher contribution rates slide, that applies to all existing plan participants in those states. And as I mentioned, Colorado has applied a reduction in the automatic cost of living adjustment to existing retirees and future retirees, of course, as well. By and large, it's new hires. But I think going forward, we may begin to see more states looking at possibly adjusting future accrual, benefit accrual rates to existing plan participants.
If I could just follow, do you think that the Colorado's measure could or will withstand a court challenge?
I'm not an attorney. I wouldn't begin to touch that. I would only say, though, that over the weekend, the Minnesota governor also signed off on a series of pension reforms affecting the 3 statewide plans, similar to what Colorado did. It also reduces the automatic cost of living adjustments for existing retirees. He signed that on Saturday night. On Monday morning, a lawsuit was filed by retirees in Minnesota, so we'll see.
Thank you for those questions. I just want to thank everyone for their active engagement. I think the level of interest in the room is really remarkable.